Thank you. And thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to be able to sit with Dr. Paul Gruenwald and talk about many issues of great interest to us all. I'd like to mention that Paul writes a newsletter, Essential Economics, which is available on his LinkedIn page, and I highly recommend it. It covers a great number of topics in a very smart, accessible way. So check that out, Essential Economics.
Thank you for the plug.
Pleasure. So let's start with tariffs. What's going on in Washington is, for many of us who follow this, head spinning. I think it's fair to say the Trump administration is taking a very aggressive approach toward tariffs. There was news again today when President Trump said he is going ahead with the 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico as of March 4th, and adding another 10% tariff on everything from China. Tell us how you see this situation and what your concerns are about its impact on the global economy and on Asian economies.
All right, I suspected we were going to start with tariffs, so maybe we should. And then first of all, it's great to be back at the Asia Society. So that's a long question. Let me see, cut me off if I start rambling too much. So I'll start with the why. You know, why would a country put a tariff on another country? And this will be the economist view, which will strike you as hopelessly naive after I explain it. But you know, Seth, suppose you and I are trading partners, and you know, I'm importing from you, but you know, I know that you're subsidizing a certain industry, those manufacturers, and then they're exporting something to me at a kind of a discounted price, and my manufacturers in my country are complaining, you know, those guys in Seth land, they're being subsidized and I can't really compete with them. So in that instance, it's perfectly within my rights under the World Trade Organization to put what we call a countervailing tariff, and that's a level playing field argument, right? So these have been used throughout history. The US, arguably in the 19th century, used a lot of these against Great Britain, whatever. But so that's one way. And then the other way is kind of the infant industry argument. I'm a smaller country, you're a bigger one. You know, I want to protect my industry while it grows and prospers, and some countries put tariffs on there. That's kind of the short version of the two ways economists would think about tariffs. But obviously, we're in a different world now, so that list has become much longer. Let's say you're, you know, you're shipping illegal drugs to my country, or I don't think you're spending enough on defense, or I don't like the way you looked at me at a particular conference, or something. There's just a whole list of things now that can be done. So that means it's complicated. So the way my team's thinking about it, and we do have a lot of demand for scenarios, et cetera, now, is to just try to keep it, you know, very clinical. What's on the table? When is it going to be implemented? How long is it going to last? What are the kind of the pros and cons, and figure out what happens to the growth rate and the unemployment rate and the inflation rate and everything else. So we're doing that on a more or less constant basis. Can I do another plug from my team? If you go to spratings.com, because the ratings division of S&P is regulated, we put everything out there for free in the interest of transparency. So we've got lots of scenarios and things out there that you can look at and see how we kind of process all these tariff initiatives that are coming out.
How about the impact on Asian economies, starting with China?
Well, the obvious one is China, right? So we had the 10% initially on China, on top of what was there already. China is a big economy, like the US is a big economy. So the tariffs don't have a huge effect on China. On the growth, it usually comes out kind of less than 0.25% of GDP, which is rounding errors. If we apply them to smaller economies and economies that have a very asymmetric trading relationship with the US, those could potentially become bigger. I'll just throw in Mexico in as an example, right? The Mexican tariffs from the US are imposed by the US. Again, marginal impact on the US, but they would probably put Mexico into recession. So I think given the size of China, given that China is a much less dependent economy or trade dependent economy than it was when I was working on Hong Kong 20 years ago. It doesn't mean that the tariffs are good. It means that it's gonna be hard to move the macro needle with these tariffs. They're distortionary and they're negative, but they're not kind of super material in the macro sense.
When you say distortionary, what do you mean?
Well, think of a world without tariffs. Let's go back to the beginning of my career in the IMF. So I started as a young economist at the IMF in 1992. The Soviet Union had just collapsed, and this was the golden age of the Washington Consensus. So this was a world when, markets were seen as good and the government had a supporting role, put in place the guardrails and basically get out of the way. No industrial policy or anything like that. Trade was basically encouraged. Countries should locate production wherever it was most profitable, kind of a borderless world, if you will. Money, capital was seen to be flowing wherever the risk-adjusted returns were highest, and this was almost like a textbook economic world. This is the way we studied, economics back when I was in school. But now if we're putting these distortions on tariffs, we're diverting trade, we're moving it away from the least cost center to a higher cost center, we're putting sanctions on countries, we're moving production around. So maybe on some risk-adjusted basis, it's better off, but kind of on a sort of the pure textbook, let's exploit our advantages and take advantage of the wonderful financial system we have. And compared with that, it's a negative. And usually output's lower, unemployment's higher, and inflation's higher. So you got to deal with those as well.
How much of the Trump approach to tariffs looks to you like economic theory or having economic goals, and how much of it is leverage?
Yeah, well, again, it's not entirely clear. Tariffs seem to be like a utility knife now, right? So you've got all these different uses for the utility knife. It's not just to create a level playing field or maybe protect an industry. It was those other things we mentioned. I think maybe China might be more of the classic one where, there's the U.S. government's view. I'm not part of the U.S. government, so this is the U.S. government's view is, there are subsidized manufacturers, and then to create a level playing field, we need a countervailing tariff. And that one seems to us to be a bit stickier. That might not go away relatively soon. Some of the other ones, I think the markets and society was pretty surprised that Canada came up early on the list, as well as Mexico. It's not clear whether those are negotiating ploys to get some other things, or there's really a strong economic case to do that. So when there's a clear case of subsidization on the other side that creates an unfair advantage, I think those are the clear ones. But a lot of this just seems to be the utility knife theory of tariffs. They're just kind of multi-purpose and could be used for multiple objectives. By the way, is a problem, right? So if you think about just a basic problem, you have a target and you have an instrument. Central bank has a 2% inflation target. They have one instrument, which is the short-term interest rate. That's seen as a good thing. If you've got one instrument and 4 or 5 targets, you're never going to be able to simultaneously achieve those with just one target. So again, what are the tariffs trying to achieve, and how do we measure success? And if you're forecasting like my team does, when do they actually come off? So that creates all these complications. So again, if we were in that nice, simple textbook world where the tariff was sort of targeting the one thing it was intended to target, it would be easier. But now with everything else in play, just a trickier world for people like me and my team.
Well, Trump was doing a lot of tariffs in his first administration.
Yes.
But it feels like a whole different scale now. How do you look at Trump 1 and Trump 2?
Well, Trump 1 got off to a slow start. We were chatting in the green room. I think there was I'm not sure they were fully prepared to win the election, and they had to get up to speed, and they hadn't, they didn't know how to use the levers of power for the U.S. government. They are clearly more prepared in Trump 2.0. So we've come out of the gate swinging, what we call flood the zone, sort of doing everything all at once, and then getting a lot of, trying to get a lot of points on the board. But again, it's not just the speed, it's the scope. And I think the scope is really what's complicating the picture. It's not as if we've got a clear view on tariffs and we're going to execute on that view quickly. It's just that everything seems to be in scope, and tariffs again seem to be like the utility knife that gets proposed to solve a lot of problems. And again, if you're trying to solve 4 or 5 problems with one instrument, you're going to have inherent difficulties with that.
So tariffs are one piece of the U.S.-China conundrum, or the U.S.-China tensions now. How concerned are you about worsening relations between U.S. and China having an effect on Asian economies?
Yeah, well, there's the spillover. Well, first of all, there are some beneficiaries, right? I think Vietnam is the country that's usually mentioned up front. So Trump 1.0 put tariffs on Chinese imports, and the Chinese manufacturers, being very skillful commercial folks, just move the stuff over to Vietnam. So you take your washing machine, you run it through Vietnam, you put a made in Vietnam sticker on it or whatever, and then you ship it to the U.S. But in terms of value added, it's still a Chinese washing machine. So that's the trade diversion approach. The other one is just moving production approach. So a lot of Chinese foreign direct investment was going into Mexico. Chinese firms were opening up plants in Mexico and, exporting that to the United States. Of course, the washing machine there says made in Mexico, and it was made in Mexico, but it's really a Chinese firm that was funded by Chinese FDI. So again, you play this kind of whack-a-mole game if you start to say, I'm trying to target Chinese trade. So I think in that sense, there have been some beneficiaries. But just overall, if we're in a world where we're trying to distort trade for reasons that aren't justified from an economic point of view, we're adding complexity to these supply chains. We're making them longer. We're making them riskier. We're making them more expensive. We mentioned Davos at the very beginning. I was in a trade session in Davos 6 weeks ago, and I asked one of the issues was Trump and how people were processing his election, and they said, well, we kind of know what he's going to do, but we are building redundancies into our business. We're holding more inventory. We're hedging our bets, and it was seen as a cost of doing business. But if you're an economist, it's kind of like a dead weight loss to the system. So that's where we come out of this.
I think many of us have noticed that in the United States, in Washington, political figures are citing national security as a reason to have greater concerns about trade and investment with China. I think I can say with confidence I have seen many instances where that is exaggerated, or where there may be a basis of legitimate national security concerns, and politicians standing in front of a microphone with cameras on takes it up to another level. How concerned are you about the national security rationale or excuse having an economic impact?
Yeah, well, that's obviously a tricky one to define. So, and this happened very quickly. So I remember I was still in Singapore at the time. It was 2015, 16. It was around 10 years ago. And I would come back to the US, a couple of times a year. And all of a sudden, in every conference on China, there was a national security panel. There was a national security expert. There were some, former State Department, military, whatever, folks in these conferences, and it just kind of ratcheted up from there. And I think, there were legitimate national, security concerns. I'm not an expert on that, but it was clear that U.S.-China relations were deteriorating a bit. But I do take your point, right? Because whether you're talking about just lobbying for tariffs or lobbying for protections or lobbying for whatever, it's hard to separate the legitimate national security from, that's just a good way for me to protect my market and lower competition and everything else. That's a super tricky one to analyze, a little bit out of my pay grade, but I think, I'm going to cop out here. Directionally, I'm in agreement with you. I think that it can be used as as an excuse for extra protectionism, and firms like big companies aren't really fans of competition, right? You want to protect your market and have managed or lower competition. So I see the case for that. I don't have any numbers or analysis to share from you, but I think it's a legitimate question and a legitimate concern.
Good. Let's turn to AI. which obviously is a topic that many of us are fascinated with, and many of us feel like we're really potentially on the brink of a new era. But let's start with U.S.-China, because there's concern, and I think a lot of people are struggling to get their heads around whether the China-U.S. competition in AI and how that connects with U.S.-China political tension is going to affect the development of AI.
Yeah, well, again, I'm not a technologist, so I'm sort of absorbing this as an economics guy. But everything I hear, and this kind of resonates with me, is AI is going to be transformational. And the example I like best is electricity. So Thomas Edison from New Jersey, right over there, for those of you who don't know, invented electricity, 1870s, 1880s, and this just entirely revolutionized the economy. It not only, displaced the candle makers and made everything and changed, the way we transport and everything. It created all these new industries, but it took a couple of decades to get through the economy, and it totally transformed it. So from a commercial point of view, the benefit should be obvious. From a kind of national security point of view, I think the implications are also obvious. Therefore, there is a big race to develop AI as quickly as possible. And we have all the tech giants in the US. They're building out these data centers everywhere. These data centers are complete energy hogs, right? So the number I have in my head is they're currently using 2 to 3% of electricity in the US. That will quickly go to double digits by the end of this decade. Oh, by the way, there's not enough renewable power to power these, so we're going back to natural gas and fossil fuel, so we're taking a step back on the energy transition. This is such an important thing, and that's a great power thing as well between China and the US. So let's talk about DeepSeek. This was a total shock, right? There was a kind of consensus that the US tech giants were ahead. We were restricting high-end chips, the NVIDIA chips, to China. So China shocked the world a couple of weeks ago when they come out with DeepSeek, which, as far as I can tell, again, I'm not an expert, largely has the same capabilities as these fancier models. It was made by lower-end chips, so the restrictions or the sanctions didn't really work. It uses a fraction of the power that these humongous data centers are using, so all of a sudden we get a big shock to the system. And I don't know where it ends up, but I think as an economist, this is going to be something that's going to permeate through the economy, revolutionize the way we do business and revolutionize the way we work. There are going to be applications that we can't even dream of. The assembly line from Henry Ford is the one we use for electricity. Nobody thought of that when Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. He didn't think of an electric-driven assembly line to make automobiles. So there's this wonderful, slightly scary world ahead of us, but there's definitely, I would say, a commercial and national security imperative too, to kind of get there first. And given the power of this thing, the potential power and the geopolitics, getting there first is clearly got some value.
And did it surprise you that the guy running DeepSeek was a quant and was sort of doing this, set this up as a side venture?
No, and it didn't strike me that China was able to do this either. I used to tell my friends when I was living in Hong Kong that Guangdong province was the most capitalistic place on the earth in some of its subsets. The competition was brutal, the innovation was brutal. Everything around Guangzhou and Shenzhen was absolutely brutal, and it didn't surprise me at all that it happened. But it just goes to show you that you put in these structures around sanctions and other things, and one view is that we're going to keep the Chinese from getting this stuff. And the other view was this is going to motivate the Chinese side to innovate more quickly. And they ended up getting to almost the same place. So there you go.
And what about the impact on job markets that as you see AI developing?
Well, there's lots of scary stuff out there, and everybody who knows who the Luddites are, right? They smashed the looms back in England, whatever century that was, and there's always a stream of folks who are justifiably worried about jobs disappearing, but we always manage to create new jobs and new companies. So I had one of the guys at work sent around a gloomy piece on AI and the job market this morning and companies. So I didn't Google, that's a wrong verb anymore. I was using AI, but I asked how many of the current Fortune 500 firms were in the Fortune 500 in 1960. I was born in 61, so I picked that as a round number. And the answer was 52. So only 10% of the firms that are currently in the Fortune 500 were there a couple of generations ago. But the point is, we keep reinventing ourselves. And I do think it's going to be positive. I'm going to pontificate here for a minute. I think I'm pontificating the whole time. But I'm pontificating because I'm very suspicious when somebody tells me that some great innovation is win-win. I'm not a fan of win-win. So globalization wasn't win-win. The energy transition's not going to be win-win, and AI is not going to be win-win. The pie will get bigger. We will probably have a better world. It will be a more productive world, but there will be losers, right? People will lose their jobs. Firms will disappear. Industries will disappear. So it falls on the leaders and the policymakers to ensure that whilst the pie is bigger, we protect the folks who are going to get hit. There's social spending, there's retraining, there's other things. We totally dropped the ball during globalization. So as a former IMF guy, this is a mea culpa, but I remember all these wonderful things about globalization and free flow of capital and, optimizing and all the stuff I mentioned before, but there were losers out of that. And we did not take care of the people who got hit. So yes, I think we're going to have a better world, but I think there's going to be employment impacts, and we have to make sure we protect those folks. Oh, can I throw in a little bit about growth? Because I think that was on the question too. So as an economist, we get the question, is there going to be like a growth dividend from AI? If this thing is really going to transform the economy, isn't there going to be a dividend, right? So let's say the US is a 2% economy, and this is our kind of speed limit or our potential growth for the next decade. How much extra juice could we potentially get from AI? And the economists are starting to put out some estimates, and they're all over the place. I mean, they literally go from zero, from the current Nobel Prize holder, Darren Agamol, who's at MIT, to 1.5% per year from the ever optimistic Goldman Sachs. So that would sort of lift it up to 3.5. The IMF's kind of in the middle there with the OECD. But imagine what it would be for the US to be kind of a 2.5%, 3% growth story over a decade rather than 2. We come significantly richer. There's a lot more jobs. There's a lot more wealth. This has to be managed, right? We don't want it to be concentrated too much, enough to ensure innovation, but not enough to sort of cause problems. But there's a potentially big windfall, and kind of managing that windfall. If you're a company, that's great. You make more money. You return it to your shareholders. But what do you do at the kind of the national level? Policymakers have to think about that. We had a peace dividend. Those of us who are old enough, we had a peace dividend, remember, in the 1990s when the Soviet Union collapsed again, and U.S. employment, a government was shrunk in a quieter way, I think, than what's being done right now. But there was a growth dividend and kind of a productivity dividend on the back of that. So could happen again.
As an economist, when you see peace dividends, when you look at periods of history where there's a peace dividend and there are other measurable improvements in economic growth, how much do you look at how human beings seem to have a tendency to take it for granted, take the benefits for granted, and focus on the things that aren't going their way?
Right. All positive shocks are eternal and all negative shocks are temporary, right? This is the way people think about it. But again, it's a window. It's a window of opportunity. And if you are, if you're the Treasury Secretary or the Finance Minister or whatever, and you have this 5 to 10 year windfall of, let's say, 0.5 to 1% faster GDP growth, what can you do? Maybe you should rebuild your infrastructure, right? Maybe you should pay down your debt. Maybe you could plow it back into your people. You build out your universities and your trade schools and your elementary schools. Maybe you want to pre-fund some of your health or anything like that. The problem is we have very short-term horizons in most countries for our politicians, and again, there's this very human tendency to extrapolate the good stuff for a very long time. And, we can fritter it away for a few years and then we'll go back and do the serious stuff 5 years from now and then it's gone. But, you have to kind of plan for it. And I think we're not quite there yet, but it's still relatively new. But at some point it would be great, not just here in the US, but, other countries to kind of think through what does it mean to have a dividend and what's the kind of best way to spend that. So maybe coming soon. We'll see.
So you mentioned different ways of thinking about globalization or different perspective. And as somebody who was at the IMF for a long time and studied Asian economies very deeply and take a global point of view now, how do you think views on globalization have evolved?
Well, the Washington consensus is gone. I think that's
just remind everybody what the Washington.
Yeah, the Washington consensus
was.
is what I mentioned earlier. It's the idea that markets are the best way to allocate resources. The government should kind of set the guardrails, but kind of get out of the way. None of this industrial policy stuff mucking up the market efficiency.
And no tariffs, right?
Low tariffs, low taxes, free flow of capital. Kind of borderless, right? You move production to where wherever it is most profitable for your firm. I think it's pretty safe to say that that's gone. I think the decoupling or the fragmentation arguments that we hear on the news are not fully supported by the evidence. We've seen some moves away from China, the China +1 strategy, the Vietnam I mentioned, or the Southeast Asia that I mentioned. But if you kind of, again, roll all that back and look where the value's being created, Asia is still a very China-centric manufacturing area, right? The value added coming out of China hasn't moved very much, although the trade has moved around a bit. So the question is, and I don't know the answer, this is the big question, Washington consensus is gone. We're obviously transitioning to a different global era, maybe a multi-polar era. It's not going to be U.S. post-World War II as kind of the benevolent hegemon or whatever the expression is. But how do we go to there, right? How do we balance China and the U.S.? What's the future of Europe, right? There's a big debate right now. Where does Europe fit into all of this stuff? Can Europe kind of coalesce and get together and be a third global pole and not just a third global manufacturing center? And then how do all these middle powers fit in, right? We've got India, we've got Brazil, we've got Saudi Arabia, and how do we put all those together? So it's definitely a more complicated world, and directionally, we kind of know where we're going to this multipolar one. How do we find a kind of stable configuration where everybody's reasonably happy and we can settle down? And whatever the next term for the Washington consensus is, someone smarter than me is going to have to come up with that. But that's I think where we're not there yet. We're clearly in the transition, and hopefully we land at some place that is kind of stable and everyone's reasonably happy, right? You don't get everything you want all the time in this world, right? You have to figure out where you compromise and, how it all fits together.
Well, it strikes me that we have seen in the past 8 to 10 years a very dramatic political shift in virtually every large country in the world.
Yep.
Things have moved in a direction of fear, and things have moved in a direction of being more conservative, more scared, more concerned about national security. Yep. We may have to wait for historians to tell us one day why that was. But I want to ask you, as an economist with a global point of view, do you see economic reasons for that, or do you think it's something else?
I think there's one economic reason, which I touched on earlier, and that is we have not done a good job of bringing everybody along, right? So we had a golden age of globalization from the early 1990s to the 2008 and 9 crisis, but the distribution of income got worse. One of my favorite factoids or factlets, whatever they're called, the distribution of income across countries went down, right? So we had a whole bunch of countries, emerging markets, mainly in Asia, but also Eastern Europe, who entered the middle class or even the upper middle class, and that distribution of income, which used to be very skewed toward the G7, is now much more even than it was before. The emerging markets, it depends where you put China in or out of that group, they're now more than half of global GDP. So in that sense, that's been very, very positive. At the same time, we have to be able to hold two thoughts in our head at the same time. At the same time, the distribution of income within countries got worse, right? So I think that's marginally true in China, definitely true in the US, definitely true in the West. And I think
Sorry to interrupt. When you say that distribution of income got worse, you mean the
rich got richer, the poor got poorer, and the middle class got stuck, however you want to define it. We have Gini coefficients and all these kind of things. But think of if you think of sort of a bell curve of distribution of incomes, the poles kind of went to each side and the middle got kind of flattened out. I think the pushback on that is contributing to our political climate. And I think the other thing that contributed was the global financial crisis. Well, first of all, that's not supposed to happen, right? If your model is markets are better than the government gets out of the way, and then, these sort of competitive, profit maximizing economies generate all this wonderful stuff. We still have a business cycle, but these big crises are a thing of the past. Well, 2008-9 was a rude awakening. So the fact that that happened, starting in the US of all places, was a big shock. And then I think the government's response to it in the US, which I think most historians would agree with this, it was at least initially skewed toward the banks rather than the households. And I think that was partially reversed. But the fact that the crisis happened and the fact that the policy response didn't really seem to protect the people in the first instance, that I think has had a lasting negative impression. So this idea that the economy generally benefits everyone, the idea that the leaders, nowadays called the elites, are kind of able to steer the ship in an equitable way, I think all of that got into question, right? So, and I think the decline of U.S. hegemony, the rise of China, the rise of emerging markets was part of that as well. But that world, I'm afraid, is gone. So we have to come up with another one.
Let's talk about climate for a minute. You've been doing work on energy, and curious to hear your perspective on how that's going.
Yeah, well, first of all, I was one of these guys who unfortunately didn't pay attention to any of this climate or sustainability stuff until 5 years ago. So I had my epiphany. My epiphany came from a wonderful report that the UK government commissioned. It was called the Dasgupta Review. There's an Indian economist, Partha Dasgupta, who I think he used to be the editor of the Journal of Development Economics. Anyway, he wrote this wonderful, sort of comprehensive piece on, biodiversity and the climate and economics. And all of a sudden, the light bulb went off in my head like 10, 20 years too late that we need to pay more attention to not just growing by accumulating physical capital and building out our plant and equipment and CapEx cycles and everything like that. There's something called natural capital, or the environment, that we need to preserve while we're growing the pie. And there's a thing called biodiversity that we have to protect. So now I've tried to do a little bit of work on thinking about how economies can grow in a sustainable way. And sustainable means you still try to increase the size of the pie, you still try to make as many people better off as possible, but at the same time, you kind of put a floor on your, you can't run down your natural capital forever, right? At some point, it's gonna be gone. So that's kind of an exciting new, it's an exciting new thing, but it opens up a lot of questions about, growth in economies and stuff like that. So should we go right into the China question? Because there's a China question on the back of that. So China is actually central to this in two ways. Well, first of all, if you look at the advanced economies, US, Western Europe, Japan, growth has basically delinked from emissions. If we can use sort of, greenhouse gas emissions as a proxy for bad stuff that happens when you grow, those three advanced regions have kind of decoupled growth from emissions, which is great. That's what you need to do if you're going to continue to grow. If you cannot decouple growth from emissions, maybe you need to think hard about whether you should be growing or not. But these three regions have managed to do that. The big question now is, well, there's this kind of awkward situation where China's the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, but if you look over time, the US is by far the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. So we can't have the current rich, low emissions countries sort of lecturing to the current fast growing, high emissions countries, but we're coming to the point where we're getting to peak China. So when you talk to the energy folks or the environment folks, this idea of peak China is when China's emissions are going to peak of greenhouse gases, and then China will join this club of being able to grow and at the same time, have the emissions go down. So that's what you need again for growth. And then, hopefully we get India and the rest of the middle powers after that. So that's number one. So the turn in global greenhouse gas emissions is really going to factor very dependent on China. Global growth is very dependent on China. Greenhouse gas emissions are very dependent on China. But China's made huge strides in renewables, as we know, solar and wind. So that's happening. I'm not sure if it's 2 years, 5 years, whatever, but it's happening very quickly. And then the other one, which I just mentioned, is China's leading role in solar power, also batteries. There's a company called CATL. I was on I was on a panel with their CEO last year. Super smart guy. He's got the best batteries in the world. The American companies want to partner with him. So China's also going to play a role in getting this technology to the rest of the world. And this is important because there's this big debate about the global south. Some people don't like that term, but let's kind of use it in air quotes. The global south, I think we know, these are the lower income countries. They're more concerned about clean water, putting a roof over their heads and getting their kids educated, and maybe they don't put as much weight on greenhouse gas emissions as we do here in the richer countries. But can we get the technology to these folks in a way that they can kind of leapfrog? In the same way that some countries never really had telephone lines, they went from nothing to mobile phones or cell phones. We can get them to kind of skip the emissions heavy part of their development path and go very quickly to renewable power and electric vehicles and everything like that. So given China's lead in electric vehicles and solar and things like that, China is going to play an important role in getting those technologies into the global south. So we know that the main climate statistic everyone looks at is the global rise in temperature. So we're at 1.5 C already from pre-industrial. That was the original Paris Agreement. We're going to go past that one, but there is still, I think, a good drive, despite the politics, by the way. I still think there's a good drive. Everyone's got awareness about sustainability. Maybe our vocabulary changes a bit, but decarbonizing the way we live our lives is the best way I like to think about it. So the advanced countries are there. China's making the turn, and I think we need the global south to get on board as well. It's doable, but I mean, it's going to take a bit of thing.
And China's making the turn because they are moving more quickly to electrification.
Electric vehicle sales in China, I think, are half or more. I think it's 9 in the US and 20-ish in Europe. So China's way ahead on the adoption and also the technology. BYD, Build Your Dreams, is taking over the electric vehicle world, and not allowed here in the US, but you see them in most other countries in Europe, et cetera. But you think about the scale and everything else, China's making big strides there. Still a lot of coal being burned, so we can again have two thoughts at the same time, but the renewables sector, electric vehicle sector and batteries, all that solar power has to be stored because the sun doesn't shine all the time, the wind doesn't blow all the time. So making progress on batteries is super important to this too. So in those couple of areas, EV, solar, and batteries, China's the global leader, so has to be leading the solution.
Yeah, those battery makers are very impressive, and not just for the scale that they're operating at, but for the innovation. And they're constant.
I'm not a chemist, but I was sitting next to this guy in this panel. He was saying very fancy words about isotopes and things like that. But, the American automakers want to partner with him. So he's got good stuff.
He's a smart guy.
Yep.
I saw a clip of him speaking at Davos, and he was talking about how they're moving toward 99% recycling goal, which they're going to achieve by 2034. So that they don't have to go mining for minerals. They won't even need to go digging for lithium. They'll just be
so
taking
much
the
for
old batteries.
so much for the lithiums and cobalts and whatever's of the world, copper, right? So yeah.
Right. And what about China's demographic trends? It's predicted to have really sharp demographic change in the coming decades.
It's a China thing and it's an Asia thing. China has already had peak population, peak labor force growth. Japan was the first Asian country to make the turn, maybe the first global country. But I think the issue with China, and maybe throw Korea and some other countries into that bucket, is this happening very quickly. So I remember this statistic. I think I remember this statistic. When I was in Korea, and Korea was making the turn. This was 20 years ago, and now China's making has made the demographic turn. It took France 150 years to transition from being an economy of young people to an economy of old people, however the UN defines that. And Korea did it in one generation. So women essentially went from having 4 children in their lifetime to 1.5 in one generation. So the demographic shift was very abrupt. So does this matter, right? So in one sense, it doesn't matter. So we weren't complaining 100 years ago that Japan didn't have enough people, so they needed more people. And if 2100 population looks like 1900 population, and that sort of very general level, it's kind of, who cares, right? It's still a country that's going to be very advanced and everything else. And, ditto for Korea, ditto for China, Germany, Italy, whatever, the whole list. Where countries get into trouble is when you have public policy that's based on the assumption that your population is always going to grow. That leads you straight into pensions, and it leads you straight into healthcare. Pensions is the big one. So we know in the US, we have our social security system where it's pay as you go. So the young people work and pay taxes, and this pays the retirement for the old folks. When the economy is growing fast and the population is growing fast, that's great because you have an ever increasing number of young folks and you have a relatively small number of old folks, so the math works. When the population pyramid flips over and you've got a small number of young folks supporting a large number of old folks, then you get into some tension, right? So that's one. And then 2 is healthcare. We're living a lot longer, and healthcare, at least in the US, is pretty expensive. So again, you're going to need to fund some of that from the public pot, and that's a challenge as well. Maybe AI and geriatric robotics help solve part of that. That might be in the future somewhere, but that's a challenge. So the challenges are really around the healthcare and the pensions. I think countries being able to innovate and grow. Some people say, well, productivity is going to go down if the population shrinks, but if it goes from 120 million to 90 or 80, whatever, you still have 80 million people, you still have universities, you still have research labs and everything. I'm not so convinced on that particular one, but we shall see.
You sound like an optimist long term.
Yeah, well, the doom and gloom crowd has been wrong so many times, right? Going back to the Luddites and the sort of the Club of Rome, and there's only so much room for so many people on the planet, and the technology is going to displace everybody. We always seem to innovate our way out of these things. So maybe I'm naive. I'll be gone by that point. But it's I guess I'm relatively optimistic.
Great. Well, very big topics, a lot to discuss, and I'd like to welcome any questions. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gruenwald. So Chinese AI is extremely cheap compared to Western AI. I was just thinking from an economist point of view, do you think Chinese AI will start displacing Western AI, kind of like manufacturing? And especially within the vogue of this current administration, how do you think the major players, which now includes government and big tech, would react to this? Thank you.
Yeah, well, first of all, remember, this is, my highlight answer is I'm not sure. The way I'm thinking about this, again, this is a multi-generational thing. If you want to use the baseball analogy, we're still in the first inning. Maybe we're in the top of the first inning. So I think again, there's an initial surprise that this presumption that the U.S. was going to be in the lead, at least initially, with the big tech firms and all the computing powers to run their large language models and all this stuff. I think DeepSeek was a shock to that. Unlike automobiles, where the technology is pretty well settled, I think AI's just got a long runway. So I think we're going to have a little bit of back and forth. It's probably mainly going to be the US and China, and I have no idea how that's going to pan out. But I think we're in very kind of early innings to all of this. NVIDIA is already doubling down on the next generation of chips, and maybe there's I don't know how much cross-fertilization is going to be. So the stuff on DeepSeek is all open source, right? So they published it all; it's all accessible. So how much of that gets integrated in the U.S. and in a good scenario, I'm not sure this is the true scenario, but in a good scenario, you have some healthy competition between the U.S. side and the Chinese side, and they're both innovating, and stuff is open source, and you're sharing, and you get to some place. And I don't know. I think it's still early. I think the shock value of DeepSeek is pretty clear. I think this model of having, big data centers with lots of power and, running huge large language models, we showed that might not be necessary to get the results out of AI in the first inning. So I think in the first inning, here we are. But I think there's a long way to go. Maybe there's more DeepSeeks on the Chinese side. Maybe there's DeepSeeks on the US side. We don't know, right?
Great. Yes, over here.
Yes. So crouching under the DeepSeek artificial intelligence umbrella, but deftly skirting the rigorous pattern of raindrops, is kind of the
You're very
game-
poetic. Okay.
Thank you. I'm a writer.
Shows.
Is
Okay.
the green toad of spyware. So my question is, how do you forecast the nature of this economic and personal data mining by China, and how predictive is this clandestine nesting doll of economic manipulation?
I've never really thought about it that way, to be honest. I'm a macro guy, so you asked me like growth, unemployment, inflation, trade,
Well,
monetary
it's kind of a
policies.
compound
So
question,
yeah, it's a bit of a compound question. I think there is going to be a little, maybe we can put that under the umbrella of this hopefully largely healthy competition where, companies have been stealing industrial secrets from each other forever. No country has a monopoly on this. And I think there's going to be some cloak and dagger stuff. An interesting twist again to that gentleman's question is DeepSeek was all open source. So it was out there and anybody can replicate this. So that doesn't sound like a super clandestine operation to me if everybody can go out there and get the information for free. So maybe to answer your question in it's going to be a spy novel, but with a tech twist on it, right? So it's going to be like an open source spy novel. So you'll have the usual cloak and dagger sort of geopolitical rivalry stuff, but then you're going to have other things that are totally out in the open that anybody can replicate. So maybe you have a novel in there. Maybe you could work on that one. I think you've got the first, you've got the introductory chapter, like the tease chapter 1 is kind of in there already, right?
And all on the blockchain.
Yeah.
Yes, the gentleman.
And it's open source because this is going to be on YouTube, right? So everybody, you have to act quickly, right? So, okay.
Maybe we were not allowed to talk about this topic, but I'm amazed we would go 1 hour without mentioning our $36 trillion debt and the fact that our interest paying that debt will exceed the defense budget.
Did you learn that from our president today? No, it was Elon Musk said
And
that.
I'm not a pro-Trumper, believe me. But I think we're really kidding ourselves. This dollar is in very serious trouble. Do you not agree?
I think, I'm going to half cop out of that question. I do agree. I know exactly what you're talking about. I'm going to give you on the other hand now because I'm an economist. There is a literal graveyard of economic papers that say once we cross this particular debt to GDP ratio, then all hell's going to break loose. The dollar's going to tank. We're going to lose our global reserve status. We're going to become a third world country. And we went past 80, 90, 100, and 120. At some point, I think you're right. The one thing that's been surprising, and I'm going to be a little bit snarky on this one, but it's not, when people talk about this, they're only talking about the supply of treasuries in the market, right? Our debt is 120% of GDP. It's 130% of GDP. It's 100 and whatever percent of GDP, which is the supply side. So you would think that flooding the market with this debt means that its price is going to go down and its yield's going to go up, and your interest payment argument is absolutely correct. But there's also a demand side to that argument, which is people want to hold US treasuries. Despite everything we've been talking about today and the relative decline of the US and the global financial crisis and the volatility that's coming out of Trump 2.0, it remains the world's sole risk-free asset and store of value. There's some competition, you know, from Europe and China or whatever, but the gap between the US Treasury bond and everybody else continues to be huge. Central banks hold it, sovereign wealth funds hold it, you know, insurance companies hold it, markets hold it, retirees hold it. And, you know, if we can maintain the balance between the supply and the demand for US dollars, then I think we are going to be relatively okay. I would love at some point, by the way, my wish list is to, you know, put the US debt to GDP direct trajectory on a down. Step one is to just start making it go down rather than go up. But, you know, given the proposals of this administration, I think that is probably not going to happen. The Congressional Budget Office, the last I checked, had fiscal policy under, by the way, Biden gets no rewards for this either. The Trump administration is going to actually be marginally worse than the Biden administration in terms of, you know, deficits adjusted for the cycle and everything else. But I agree with you. At some point, we got to turn it around. But we continue to see a world where... Yeah. But again, remember the graveyard of economists I mentioned. But yeah, I mean, I know what you're saying, but you know, there's a demand side too. Anyway, let's move on.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for the amazing talk. I'm particularly interested in tariffs, and I'm also a little bit perplexed by the fact that many people voted for Trump because they complain about inflation and high grocery price, but in the meantime, they also support tariffs on China and Mexico, as if higher tariffs will lower the grocery prices. I'm just very curious, with the increasingly upsetting Republican constituents about continually high inflation and grocery price on eggs, do you forecast that will force the current administration into a kind of a rollback or U-turn on their tariff policy once they connect the dots between tariffs and higher grocery price? Thank you.
Are you asking me to get inside Donald Trump's brain? Is that what the question is? So, I mean, I agree with you. There is a tension, let's put it mildly, between wanting inflation to come down and putting tariffs on, because they are a tax on imports. And by the way, if you start deporting lots of people from the country, that reduces the labor supply and wages goes up, and that's inflationary. And if you want to juice up the fiscal stance with more debt, like the gentleman just asked, that's inflationary as well. So, you know, it's great to talk about productivity, and it's great to talk about a business-friendly economy, and it's great to talk about, you know, sensible regulations. I agree with all that stuff, but the three main pillars that I just mentioned are all, I think, on net balance, inflationary. And the markets agree with you, right? As soon as it became clear that Trump was going to win, the forecast for the Fed funds rate later this year jumped by 100 basis points. So we thought the Fed was going to stop cutting rates earlier, and then bond yields are up. So yeah, I mean, there's a tension there that hasn't been resolved yet. How it plays out, I think, you know, we'll have to wait and see. Maybe it goes away, but I agree with you that those two definitely do not line up.
The price of eggs is still going
I was going to
up.
say eggs. I'm glad Seth said it. Eggs are very expensive right now, right?
I think we had another question here. Yes?
I think the question is very similar. Thank you.
You want me to get inside of Donald Trump's brain too? So I'm not sure I could do that. So
Hi, nice to see you again.
yeah, I remember you. Hi. So, yeah.
So as we already know that the current situation index and the consumer expectation index they decreased 4 to 7%, and this a few days ago, like 2 days ago, bond year has lowest points since. Yeah. So as Trump said, there will be a contraction due to the sticky inflation and the side effects from tariff, of course. Do you think he's telling the truth, or do you think there will be economic instability or stagnation?
That's becoming a very popular question, by the way. So, well, first of all, let's go back to the beginning of the year. The U.S. economy was outperforming its peer group, the other advanced economies, by a pretty wide margin, right? For the last 2 or 3 years, most advanced, when there was an inflation shock, central banks raised interest very quickly. Most economists, including me and my team, said growth is going to slow down, right? We had the fastest inflation in 40 years. We had the fastest rise in interest rates in 40 years. So we were expecting a slowdown. Every major country in the world slowed down except for the US. The US just stayed at 3% growth and about 4% unemployment, which is just, hitting the ball out of the park, as we say, right? It was a really exceptional performance. What's happened over the last month, and it happened very quickly, is we've seen a divergence between what we call the hard data, sort of measuring sort of dollars and spending and production, and the soft data, which are sentiments and surveys, et cetera. The soft data aren't perfect, but usually when you get a wedge like that, you start to worry that either the hard data has to go down to the soft data, or the soft data is going to improve and go back to the hard data. So you normally don't see long periods where the stuff we're measuring in the economy is very different from people's sentiment. I want to mention one variable that I discovered last week. So this is like the mea culpa part of the presentation. So the Fed produces an index called the U.S. Policy Uncertainty Index. So you can look on your phone if you want to do that. This has been around since the 1980s, and I've never heard of it, right? So this came up on a LinkedIn thread last week. I said, oh, that's interesting. So I clicked on it, and you go to the Fed's website, and there is the U.S. Policy Uncertainty Index. And think about U.S. policy uncertainty. Usually it's pretty flat. Nothing's really happening. There have been 3 spikes in this index since it was started in the late 1980s. Spike number 1 was the global financial crisis. And think about that, right? Biggest economic downturn since the recession. As I said earlier, this wasn't supposed to happen. Policymakers were understandably scrambling. They had an impossible task to put together a policy package, but there's a spike in the policy uncertainty index. And then it came down a few months later, but that was spike number 1. Spike number 2, you can guess, was March 2020, when the COVID pandemic struck. We had to shut down the economy, first pandemic in 100 years. Government wasn't sure how to respond. Policy uncertainty index spikes to roughly the same level as a global financial crisis. And then over the following months, it comes down. And the third spike was January 2025, which was last month. And that was like a self-induced, that was not a pandemic, that was not a depression-style global financial crisis. That was just, the Trump administration coming out of the gates. What's the expression? Flood the zone. Flood the zone as you just do everything all at once. And, tariffs have as we started out with, tariffs have a rationale, but the way they're being used is very confusing. We've rationalized the size of government before. In the Clinton administration in the early 90s, there was a big reduction in government employment in a much more sort of orderly and predictable and quiet way. Elon Musk is not being very quiet about it. And I think we're just having a lot of uncertainty now. But again, that sort of really unprecedented jump, we have to, either that goes away and we're okay, or the real economy and the stuff we really care about, which is growth and employment and production and everything else, kind of goes down to the sentiment. That's the big thing everybody's watching, by the way, in the next couple of months. That is going to be absolutely key if you're kind of watching the short-term stuff.
Right. Yes.
I haven't mentioned Indonesia yet or Mongolia, I'm sorry. So.
No, it's okay. With the introduction of all these new tariffs, there's a lot of talk about BRICS economies. And we've been seeing the group expand recently with the inclusion of Indonesia. I'm from Malaysia, by the way. Okay. How do you see the role of BRICS and its impact on the global economy? And this should the U.S. even be concerned about, these expansion? Thank you.
Okay. As a trading bloc, yes. I mean, if you look at global trade these days, I love these maps where they show a map of the world and you show everybody's main trading partner, right? Most countries have China as their main trading partner, and there's a smaller group for the U.S. And, I mentioned the middle powers already. So, India, Brazil, Saudi, those guys are going to play a bigger role. So I think on the trade side, maybe the foreign investment side, definitely they have a bigger share of global GDP. That is all kind of a secular structural story, right? We're in that world for the foreseeable future. The one thing that's really strange, if you came in from Mars and you looked at the economy and you saw, I remember I mentioned before, inequality across nations has come down quite a bit. After the Second World War, we were in a US centric world, we were in a dollar world. We've become much more balanced in terms of global growth, global GDP, global trade, global investment, except in one particular area, which is currency. We are still in a predominantly US dollar world in terms of reserves, in terms of store of value, in terms of contract. If you go into the crypto world and go to your favorite crypto website, look at all those cryptocurrencies, 90-something% of them are pegged to the US dollar. So BRICS is super important for the trading economy, for GDP and some of the investment, but we still have this imbalance where on the financial side, we're still in a dollar world. I don't know how that resolves, but or if it resolves, but the US has this exorbitant privilege, right? It's called the exorbitant privilege of issuing the world's risk-free asset, which is the treasury, we talked about that, and issuing the world's risk-free reserve currency, which is the dollar. So open question on how long that lasts, but we're still there. I mean, again, to the gentleman's question on debt, people have been predicting the demise of the dollar for a long time, and we're still here, right? It's sticky. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you for being here today. I know you went to UT Austin, and
Ooh, you checked my
your LinkedIn page.
I'm
actually.
a Longhorn, right?
Yes,
So, yes.
I'm from Houston, and I think one of the biggest slogans that Trump had during his campaigning was "Drill, baby, drill," and I wonder what's your take on the future of the oil, natural gas industry. I haven't heard anything about his move on energy sector yet. So what do you see in terms of like the next few years about energy?
Okay, first,
if there's still a possible future for it?
First, yes. The short answer is yes. Well, first of all, I want to put in a plug for something that S&P Global sponsors every year. It's called CERA Week, CERA Week. Yeah. It's an energy conference in Houston run by a guy named Dan Yergin, also a Pulitzer Prize winner. I'm sure you know Dan. Seth. This is, again, we, S&P Global bought this firm 3 years ago. I've got to know Dan pretty well since then. This is essentially the World Bank, IMF annual meetings for energy. There's 100 countries, all the ministers are there, all the bankers are there, all the policymakers are there, the tech guys are there. One thing I learned very quickly is when you talk to the people who actually build these businesses, run these businesses, and think in terms of what they call molecules and electrons rather than finance, they have a different way of thinking about the world. But the first point is, when you said you were from Houston, what immediately occurred to me is, Houston's becoming the global capital, at least a US capital for energy transition. So sort of Silicon Valley is to tech as Houston is to the energy transition. There is an enormous amount of investment from the oil majors into renewables. So these are now energy companies, they're not oil companies. But what you learn in this conference is a couple of things. One is you can't just turn off the fossil fuel system like a light switch, right? We mentioned China already. We mentioned other countries building out renewables. That is going to take time. I think that fossil fuels are going to be around for a while. You can capture the carbon. You can decarbonize the process. We're already capturing a lot of the methane. So we're figuring out ways to lighten the carbon footprint, but you can't go to zero very quickly. Because basic things, steel, cement, plastics, what's the other one? Fertilizers, these are all very heavy petroleum based, and they're the foundation of our modern economy, so we can't get rid of them. So we got a bunch of scenarios on our website if you want to look at them for these decarbonization paths. Some are more optimistic than others, but fossil fuels are still going to be around. They're going to kind of fade out in importance as we build out solar, wind, and even these modular nuclears are going to be a decade away. But lots of exciting stuff going on there. So,
What else? Or is it true that we've covered the globe and covered all the big topics to your satisfaction?
we have a question in the back. Can you wait for the microphone? Yeah, you have a good voice, but not a great voice. Okay.
Thank you. Going a little bit, in a broader perspective, you've been talking about the next step from the Washington Consensus, whatever it will be called, post-Washington Consensus. And you were also talking about that we have to make sure that more people are taken on board getting the benefits of new developments. And you also mentioned that there is a possibility for these global South countries to have this leapfrog, right?
Yep.
So the question is, how is there a way to make sure that it won't be new kind of technology colonialism for those countries who are trying to get on board? Is there the models that will make sure that those countries whom we are trying to bring on board are developing equally with others?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? So there's another thing I'm working on called the just transition, right? So the just transition means that we go down this path of decarbonization and we make our economies more environmental sustainable in a way that kind of balances the interests of the North. And I think it's probably fair to say the North puts a higher weight on emissions reduction, balance those with the needs of the South, and these folks put a higher weight on growth because they want to grow and have clean water and health and nice housing and everything else that some of us enjoy. Yeah, and the colonialism, I mean, I don't know. It's just I think if we spread the technology, or a lot of the technology is again kind of it's open source and not exclusionary. So I think that's a positive thing. But again, I'm pretty hopeful. Look at what happened in Asia over just 2 generations, right? So again, I spent some time in Korea after the Korean War. South Korea was a lot poorer than North Korea, and they were kind of written off as sort of a perpetually poor country. And 2 generations later, we have Samsung and LG and leading industrial power and K-pop and LA Chicken and all that stuff, right? So we have lots of good stuff coming out of there. So I think the other way, I'm going to put on my old IMF bureaucrat hat here, but the globalization had a lot of good stuff, right? So if we want to make sure we still have relatively free flows of knowledge and money and technology, and we're going to have national security. That's fine. Every country has a right to do that. But given that, I think we want to kind of maximize the benefit of this free flow of knowledge and money and production and everything else. And in my view, that's the best way to kind of bring as many people up as possible. If we go back into our little autarkies and into our closed economy world, I don't think that's a very good one.
Well, that is a great
happy note.
a great note to end on, a macro point of view. So thank you. Thank you for all the great insight. Thank you, everyone, for coming.